All right, guys, we're going to try something different today. I'm going to talk over this PowerPoint, give you a quick lecture. I'll try to be as fast as I can. So today we're going to be talking about the alternative causes of World War II. Now, in this class, and probably your previous classes on U.S. history, you've learned about how aggressive, angry, racist leaders like our guy in the middle here, Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany, caused World War II. And that's not wrong. His aggressive actions, like invading countries, initiating the Holocaust, those things played a huge role in starting World War II. But to really understand what caused World War II, we have to see why he did those things and why his people allowed him to. So he was a dictator, but initially Hitler was elected. Also, these guys on the left and right of him. On the left is Hideki Tojo of Japan. He was a military leader of Japan. There's an emperor, there's a prime minister that were in charge of the government, but his militaristic invasions of other countries is what also caused World War II to happen in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. And then on the right of Hitler, you have Benito Mussolini of Italy, who also invaded, who helped Hitler, who was an ally, a staunch friend of Hitler. So we need to understand what were the motivations behind these fascist dictators and why did they feel the need to invade other countries. That's really the root cause of World War II. So as we can see here, let me just, can I get, okay, the Great Depression is the cause, is a major cause of World War II, okay? During this time period, and especially in Germany, we see after World War I, the German economy just tanks. And that's because of the very vindictive and harsh Treaty of Versailles that made, in 1914, the German dollar or German mark was worth, 4 German marks was worth $1. By 1923, it was 4.2 trillion with a T, German marks equaling $1 US. That's an economic collapse that hopefully we never see, okay? The German people were desperate. Now, the Great Depression happened all around the world. All countries were affected by it. So while Germany was maybe the most desperate, all countries were desperate. Some of those countries turned to new leaders like dictators that were going to rise up and restore their country or build up their country to glory, okay? These dictators, they got their start from desperate people. You know, people always ask, like, well, how could anybody vote or want Hitler to take control of their country? Well, he talked a lot about building Germany up, making it better, restoring the pride to the German people. A lot of people liked that, and they were maybe willing to overlook some of his huge, glaring negatives that we now see today. Another thing that happened during the Great Depression is relationships between countries go bad. This is mostly going to have to do with trade. Countries are no longer going to want to trade with each other because they'd rather just produce everything within their country to give jobs to their own people. So trade relationships go away. So all of this is going to lead to anger, blame, racism, frustration. Specifically, we'll see blame and racism with Hitler blaming the Jews as this inside group within Germany that's sabotaging the German country. Okay, so we're going to have 2 groups of countries emerge in the 1930s that are going to kind of lead us into World War II. We first have democracies, which the United States is a part of, obviously. The way that the United States focused on dealing with the Great Depression was obviously the New Deal, which we talked about in the last unit. But another thing that they did was opening up free trade across the world. Okay, they said we need resources like food, just everyday household appliances, materials for our factories. Well, where are we going to get them? Well, let's trade with other countries. Let's work collaboratively. Okay, that's how we're going to fight back against the Great Depression. And additionally, these democracies believe in individual rights and personal liberty. Dictatorships had a completely opposite approach. They needed the resources too to fight back against the Great Depression. But the way they decided to do it was to take it from weaker, less powerful countries around them. Take their land, take their resources, take their materials, even take their people and force them to be their slaves. Okay? The way that Hitler and other fascist dictators were able to do this was to get their people to believe in hyper nationalism. We all have a certain level of nationalism, pride in our country, the fascist dictators created a cult of nationalism in their country that really created an idea that the country is more important than the individual. So we can see this in these two examples, Japan and Germany. On the left, especially with Japan, Japan is the red country, the islands off to the right-hand side of that left-hand map, if that makes sense. Early on, Japan in the 1800s was relatively backwards in technology. They were still fighting with samurai swords and bows and arrows, while the United States was fighting the Civil War with guns and artillery and cannons. So Japan had to rapidly change their economy and their society to kind of keep up with the rest of the world. So they did that really successfully. Take a Japanese history course, learn about the Meiji Restoration. But when they were building up their society, they realized that their islands, their home islands, the red islands on there, lacked natural resources and also a lot of farmland that they needed to feed their growing population. So the first thing they had to deal with was food. That pink area, so you can see here in Korea and Manchuria, which is part of China today, and also Taiwan, this island off the coast of China, these became basically plantations of Japan. They would enslave the local populations, they would send a small force of Japanese soldiers to watch over it, and they'd send food back to the Japanese homeland. As World War II gets closer and closer, Japan continues to move into what is now the heartland of China. Peking, right here, is what we call Beijing today, the capital of China. So all of this was really used for the farmland to feed the Japanese army and soldiers and people as Japan was growing. Now, the major thing that Japan also lacked was oil and rubber, which is how they made their army. Oil and rubber are incredibly important to making guns and tanks and cars and planes and all the things that were keeping Japan safe or strong and powerful. The way that they got these initially was by trading with the United States. The United States, with our oil fields in Texas and Alaska and around our country, we shipped them oil. But we didn't like that they were doing all this invading of other countries. So eventually we told them that we were going to cut off their oil supply. Now, this was a threat to Japan because to keep the food coming, they needed the oil to keep their military in control of these regions. So by us cutting off their oil, we were also cutting off their food. So Japan knew that they were going to go to war with the United States. They did Pearl Harbor. That was a preemptive strike against us to make sure, us being the United States, to make sure that we weren't going to be able to interrupt their food supply. After they do Pearl Harbor, all of this purple territory is taken. One thing that's really important about this purple territory down here in the seas, it has a lot of rubber and it has a lot of oil. That's what they needed to fund their military to keep it going. Okay, so Japan wasn't trying to conquer the United States or wipe out the American people. Really, the Japanese did Pearl Harbor and started World War II for us because of resources, because they needed to feed their people. Okay, and they had a very different idea. Instead of trading peacefully for it, they took it from other countries. Germany is very similar, although it's a little bit shorter of an explanation. Basically, when Hitler comes to power, he has this idea called Lebensraum, or living space, freedom, free land for the German people to grow crops on. Originally, it just applied to places that spoke German, where the German people are from, which we can see in brown here, as well as kind of the pink areas, and which is the Rhineland and the Sudetenland. He wanted to take those territories for Germany. Also Austria. Austria is a German-speaking territory as well. Austrians are just a different type of German, really. But then he expanded into Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia, which are not German, speak different languages. The reason for this is because he considered them to be inferior people, and he wanted their farmland. The one major invasion that Hitler is going to do, which is not on this map, but he did for the pure reason of wanting their farmland, was the invasion of Poland. He considered the Polish people incredibly inferior to the Germans. He wanted their farmland. He wanted to exterminate as many Poles or enslave them to feed the German people. Again, a lot of Hitler's wars were based on racism and this idea of German superiority. But at the root, it was also about getting resources and food for his people. Not to justify his actions, taking food and resources from other countries is still obviously morally wrong, but that is a root cause of what he was doing. Now, not to say that they were the only ones. So we also see Italy here, another fascist country, expanding into Africa with Libya and Italian East Africa. We also notice that France, one of the democratic countries of the world, controlled lots of territory that wasn't really theirs. Same with Britain, all this blue territory in here. We can see this on the next map as well. Britain is in pink on this map, all of this territory in Africa, all of India with its hundreds of millions of people, all of Australia and New Zealand and islands and small areas around the world. So the democratic countries also used territorial expansion to help themselves, but in a lot of ways it was different. And this is not I'm not going to get into it too much in this lesson, but they use these as ways to trade more, to open up trade routes, which is still, it's not perfect, but it wasn't the aggressive enslavement or domination that the Germans or the Japanese were doing to other people. So as we get into World War II, we see two sides form up as the main powers in World War II. We have the Allies, which is mostly democracies, United Kingdom, France, not the Soviet Union. They're a dictatorship, but they hated the Germans. They hated Hitler. So they sided up with kind of an enemy of my enemy is my friend type situation. The United States, another major democracy, although we get in much later, 1941. So, France is already surrendered by the time we get into the war. And also China. China is kind of an underrated ally. They don't get talked about as much, but they did fight with the United States against Japan. The axis is going to be dictatorships. They're ones that are just trying to take the resources for themselves. It's going to be Germany, Italy, and Japan. So when we look at World War II, we see a lot of good versus evil. We see dictators versus democracies, but we also see different ideas about how to get resources. How do we feed our people? On the one hand, with the Allies, for the most part, it's about trading, opening up the world, freely associating and sharing resources, collaborating with each other. Whereas on the Axis side, we see taking, dominating, getting resources by force. It's two different philosophies on how you run a country and how you solve the Great Depression.